Well, good morning. Oh, some of you survived. I know yesterday was a taxing day. For a lot of you that were at the Verizon Event Center yesterday, as we did the Fall Fest thing, it was mayhem. Like, it was just crazy, and in a good way. But there were so many people, and so I know a lot of you are sore today from playing games with kids where you had to keep picking things up and giving them back to them. Annie Rain figured out a great system where she would say, "Kids, I'll give you more candy if you pick up the rings off the pumpkins and bring them back to me." That's a great way to do that. You earn your trick-or-treating situation there, and I think that's worth it. I think that's good. So there were some awesome things. We had everybody. The thing that was awesome was it was out in the parking lot. We had folks that had made their own games. They'd brought their own games. So we had people doing. Annie was doing a ring toss with kids where they were trying to ring around the stem of the pumpkin. Is it called a stem? Is that what that's called? So right there, like they were doing that kind of game with glow sticks, trying to put those on there. Teresa had made this fantastic game where she had wrapped toilet paper with like colorful Halloween colors around it with tissue paper, and they were bowling pumpkins to knock down these toilet paper rolls that were pyramided up, which was really cool. And so she put up with my kids way longer than she needed to doing that. The Bracy's had made a game where they were doing essentially a cornhole type of thing that I was miserable at myself. Like I tried it for about a good 15 minutes and did not do well, not at all. And so that was, I think, a little unfair. I think that there was something rigged in that game. I'm not really sure. I don't think the pumpkins that we were throwing through the holes were regulation size, and I think that was the issue we were dealing with there. And the Moultons, they had made a table where they had a pumpkin tic-tac-toe board where each pumpkin was either an X or an O, and you could play tic-tac-toe. And so it was awesome having that outside. Then people would come inside, and we had a booth inside, and we had a few of us there at the booth, and Annie was doing the free family photos we've done in a conference room behind that table. Annie by herself yesterday did 56 families photo shoots. Now, on a normal free family photo day where we do the registration, we do the outdoor photos, all that stuff, Annie and I both shoot those, and we together do 66 families. So she did 56 all by herself yesterday, which was pretty amazing. So she was very sore and very tired, and Di and Betty Ann and some of these folks were helping her out with that. So it was a big day. The awesome thing is we came in contact with so many people. We walked away with hundreds of email addresses and phone numbers and people we could contact again, but we made such a great impression. Again, the goal isn't that we make a great impression for restoration necessarily. The goal is that we make a great impression for the church at large when we're in these spaces, where we're the hands and feet, we're the face of Jesus in these spaces, where we're not just for us, but people who would maybe never go to church or have some serious doubts about being in church, those kind of things. Those would be the kind of people that we would at least be making a good impression on, where maybe the church isn't so bad. Maybe we're here to serve, and maybe just to be in your space for a little bit with you. So it was an awesome, awesome day. Thank you so much to everybody who was a part of that. We are missing quite a few today because I don't know, like, you guys are also the only ones that have survived the sickness that's going around. It's crazy. I got so many texts last night and Facebook messages. People are like, "I'm not going to be there in the morning. I'm really sick." And I really appreciate that because it's kind of funny. Like, I don't personally take attendance, and I appreciate getting the notes where I'm like, "Thanks for letting me know." Like, it's actually really nice to know if people aren't going to be here, but it's just funny. These weren't people who were serving today. I didn't really need to know, but I told them with the proper doctor's note we would excuse them for today. So anyways, they won't be here today. Today we wrap up this Benefit of the Doubt series. And so it's the last week of this series. Again, last week in this space, Teresa put together a lovely gift basket for the folks here at this space that we're going to give them today as we kind of exit this place and go to the next, because they've been very gracious with us. It's been an awesome place for us to meet. But this is our last Sunday in this space, last Sunday of this series. And so we're going to wrap up this Benefit of the Doubt series with the patriarch of the doubters, right? So it's a guy named Thomas. And Thomas, he says these words. If you don't even know the story of Doubting Thomas, you probably know the name of Doubting Thomas. Like, poor Thomas, he gets this bad rap, like, because he says these words. And somehow from then on, he becomes one of those people with an adjective before his name for the rest of his life. Like, he becomes like an honest Abe, or, like a Debbie Downer, or like type of situation, or like a cranky Sue, or a negative Nelly. He becomes that. Or if you're a Dave Matthews fan of Dancing Nancy, I'm not sure what that is. It's just in a song. But if you're those are the he becomes this guy who suddenly will always be known as a guy with an adjective in front of his name. He will always be known as Doubting Thomas from that day forward. But we've been looking at this and saying maybe doubt isn't such a bad thing. In fact, maybe doubt is a necessary thing. Again, last week we talked about that maybe doubt is not a stumbling block, but maybe it's a stepping stone into our faith. And so there's this great quote by Tim Keller. If you've ever heard of Timothy Keller, he's a great theologian, brilliant guy. And he wrote this. I love this quote that he has. It's in his book called Reason for God. And it says, "A faith without some doubts is like a human body without any antibodies in it. People who blithely go through life too busy or indifferent to ask hard questions about why they believe as they do will find themselves defenseless against either the experience of tragedy or the probing questions of a smart skeptic. A person's faith can collapse almost overnight if she has failed over the years to listen to her own doubts, which should be only be discarded after long reflection. Believers should acknowledge and wrestle with doubts, not only their own, but their friends and their neighbors." And that's where this series came from. I think that we have to realize that doubt is okay. It's a natural thing. It's a part of our faith. It creates a stronger faith in us. It creates something that's actually good for us. And it comes through tragedy. It comes through hardship. It comes through tough times. But we have this, and I think that we also have to realize that we don't even wrestle all the time with our own doubts, but with the doubts of those around us. That's where the series came from. Was I was talking to a lot of people that I knew who didn't go to church. And as I talked to them, I realized that their biggest concern with coming to church was, I have too many doubts. I don't know if I belong in a church. Like, there's things I question about the Bible. There's things I question about religion. There's things I question about Jesus. I don't think I can come to church. And all I could say was like, that's why you should come to church. Like, that's exactly why we want you there. We're not going to judge. We're not going to criticize. We want to say that we've had those too, and we still wrestle with those ourselves. And we want to be honest about that. And so today we want to look at Thomas and look at his story. We're going to look at kind of that famous story of Thomas and the fated words that will always make him doubting Thomas from that day forward, right? And so this brings me to a really important point. Before I had kids and before I decided to plant churches and stuff, I had a lot more free time, and I would read books just for fun. I remember those days. Some of you remember those days, when you just took naps, just frivolously, just living la vida loca. And I would read books just for fun. And I read this book, and you may have heard of this. You may have seen the movie, but I actually read the book of The Princess Bride. Anybody seen this movie, The Princess Bride? Yes, you should. If you haven't, that's really unfortunate. It was like a youth group classic growing up when I was a kid because it was moderately clean and super quirky. And there was that one bad word that Inigo Montoya would say, but then we'd have to mute it real quick and then get back to the film. I was just like, what did he say? Was it that B word? And so, he would say that one bad word and we'd have to mute it. But other than that, it's a great movie, right? But I remember watching this movie over and over again. In fact, when I was a kid, we lived in Casper, Wyoming. I don't know why. We lived in Casper, Wyoming, and they had this downtown theater that over the summer would do midnight matinees, and they would show a movie every night at midnight for a quarter. It was literally a quarter, and they would show Princess Bride every night over the summer for a quarter. So I watched it every night of the summer, and so I really got to know it. So I decided I wanted to read the book to see if it was any different. It's not. It's really pretty much the same. But the interesting thing about the book is that at the beginning of this book, there's this preface where William Goldman, who rewrote the book, he gives this preface to the book. And it's very interesting because the story that we know of The Princess Bride is not the whole story. It's not the entire story. So what happens is, if you remember the scene where Fred Savage is in bed at the beginning of the film, and he's laying in bed and his grandfather comes in to read him a book. That's how William Goldman found out about the book, The Princess Bride. He was sick at one point, and his grandfather came to read him this book called The Princess Bride. So he grew up learning the story of The Princess Bride. He heard it, he loved it, he thought the story was awesome. So one day, he was a grown man, and he had his own son, and his son was sick and was going to be at home for a while, and so he bought his son a copy of the full version of The Princess Bride. And he sent it to his son. He said, read this while I'm gone, you're going to love it. And so he comes back home a couple weeks later, and he sees his son. He's like, how'd you like the book? And his son was like, that was a terrible book, Dad. It was horrible. He's like, what do you mean it was horrible? He's like, it was so boring. What was that about? And he was like, I love that book. Like, you don't like the book? He's like, no, that was a terrible book. So he went and he found the copy of the book he had bought, and he opens it up and he notices it's significantly thicker than the book he had been read. And he notices, like, as he reads through the story, this is not just a story of giants and true love and wizards and all this stuff. It's not that story. It's not a story of all those things. What the story is actually is it was really written to be a narrative, a historical narrative of the downfall of the monarch of Florence. It just so happens there's a story within it of Wesley and Buttercup and the Six-Fingered Man. That just happens to be embedded inside the story. But the story is much larger, and it's actually kind of a boring story. And his grandfather, when he had read it to him, had only read the good parts. He just read the parts that were really good, and he kind of like got to know the good parts of the story. And so he kind of edited it for him and found these parts of the story that were really interesting. And he found these parts that were different than anything he'd ever read. They were really interesting parts. And today, when we look at this story of Thomas, John writes the story. John has it in his book, and John is kind of this guy. He finds a different part of the story to tell more often than not. If you read the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're very similar. They have similar stories, similar accounts in there. But when you get to the Gospel of John, he has a very different story that he tells. He's the only one to record Jesus walking on the water. He's the only one to record Jesus washing the disciples' feet. John has a significantly different story to tell. And he kind of edits in these other parts of the story of Jesus. And the story of Thomas is only a story that John tells. Only John tells the story. And there's interesting reasons for that. Because at this time when John writes the book of John, if we zoom out and we look at the whole picture, he's writing this in about 90 years, 90 AD. Now this is about 60 years after Jesus has left the earth. And it's about 20 years after the uprising against Rome, which actually killed off a lot of believers. It's a tough time for people because people thought, we're now 90 years AD, we're 60 years after Jesus left, and 20 years after this horrible event. And it's a time where people thought Jesus was coming back right away. When Jesus said he was leaving, he never said like when he was coming back. And so people thought it'd be like, I don't know, a week or two from now. You know, it only took him 3 days to come back from the grave. I don't know how long it could take him to come back from heaven. It doesn't seem like it should take that long. Right? And so they're thinking like, how long will it take for Jesus to come? And there's people that are very discouraged. And Christians are starting to become more and more discouraged. And they're starting to have doubts because there's no longer as many eyewitnesses to Jesus as there once were. And so John is using the story of Thomas really as a metaphor for the entire Christian faith at this point. Saying not all of you are going to get to see it the way Thomas did. But let's use Thomas as really an emblem of all of us, all of this first century Christendom, to see what it would be like if we got to be right next to Jesus, if we got to see him in person. So he edits in this really great story of Thomas to show these believers what they would be like, what it would be like if this was the case. And as we walk through the story, I want to dispel a couple of myths about faith that I think lead to our doubt. Because sometimes I think we misunderstand faith, and that leads us to doubting, which makes us concerned about our faith, and we think we're in a crisis of faith. But if we can understand faith better, I think we'll understand our doubts better as well. So I want to walk through the story. It's in John chapter 20. You can find it there, and we'll read it through the lens of kind of this first century Christian looking at this story. So it begins in verse 19. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with locked doors for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them. So Jesus has just risen from the dead. They have not seen him yet. The disciples have not all seen him yet. And they're in this locked room. And again, Jesus does some weird miracles sometimes where you're like, was that really necessary? But this is one of them where he just pops through a door, like he does. And he just shows up and he's in the room with them. And Jesus came and stood in front of them and said, "Peace be with you." After he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. So they're like pumped. They got to see Jesus. He shows them his hands, which I'm sure, like, again, remember these disciples were not all like grown men. Some of these were young guys. And I'm sure they were like, whoa, dude, look at that's going to scar over so nasty. That's awesome. And like you have the one like queasy guy who's in the corner like, oh, put it away, Jesus. I don't like this very much. You know, but you have them probably like being really pumped about like the holes in his hands, the scars in his side. Like they're probably pretty excited about it. So Jesus is like showing off his battle wounds. He's showing off these scars, and the guys are taking it in. But Thomas, also known as Didymus, which is awesome because he was the original like T. Diddy or something, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So Thomas didn't get to be there for that. He didn't see that moment. He wasn't a part of that. He didn't get to see the battle scars. He didn't get to see the scars in Jesus' hands and on his side. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord. We've seen him." But he said to them, and here's the famous words, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand to his sides, I will not believe." I'm not going to do it. Now, Thomas, if you read through the rest of the Gospels, you'll find that Thomas is not a doubting guy throughout the entire Gospel. He's actually a pretty committed guy. But something's shaken him. Something's concerned him. And these other guys come and they're like, "Dude, we saw Jesus." And he's like, "Yeah, no." Just like these first century Christians, they didn't get to see Jesus. And he's like, "Yeah, I'm glad you guys think you saw that. But until I have that experience, until I'm standing in your shoes, until I've had the exact same moment, I'm not going to buy it." And he wants to like literally touch the holes in his hands. He wants to actually feel his side. It doesn't say that the other disciples got to do that, by the way. It doesn't say that they all touched Jesus. It just says they saw him. But he's like, "No, I want to take it a step further. I actually want to like put my finger through the hole in his hand and see if it works. I want to see this up close." He actually wants to touch him and see the actual scars. He's like, "I'm not going to believe it." And it's crazy to me because the thing that he says there, "Until I see this, until I touch him," those kind of things, the truth is, it's funny because he's just saying what we're all thinking. Let's not kid ourselves. We were playing a game the other night. We were at the Bracey's house. And Janessa's not in here, so I can tell this story. And we were playing, what was that game? It was like Mad Gab or something. Have you ever played this game where you're supposed to like read a card and it says like two words that sound like something, and they're supposed to sound like another word, like phonetically. I don't know how to describe that well, but you'd have these two words you're trying to say. And Janessa, when she plays games, is somebody, how do you say it delicately? You don't want on your team. Let's just say that. That kind of thing. She means well, but man, she's not the most helpful sometimes. We played one game one time where she told us, "He's the Beatle that you went to go see him in concert." And we were like, "We went to see Paul McCartney." And she's like, "No, it's not Paul McCarthy." And she was like, "It's another one, another Beatle. You went to see him in concert." And we were like, "I don't know. There's only one other living Beatle. It was Ringo." She's like, nope, not him." And then finally she was like, and we were like, "Well, then who is it?" And she was like, "Guys, it's John Legend." Who was not a Beatle so much. So anyway, she's not the person you want on her team. There was this moment where she starts laughing and she couldn't get the cards and she was doing a terrible job and she's laughing and she's starting to laugh so hard that she cannot focus on anything else. And the cards are all over the table and now she's not even able to move the cards and everybody's still yelling at her. And they're like, "Hey, stop doing that, Janessa. Just say the word. Say what you're supposed to say." And she's like, "I can't do it." And they're still trying to do it, to guess things. They're yelling at her and she's like laughing harder and harder. And finally the timer just runs out, which is good. It saved her. And Vinny Finnicaro looks over, if you know Vinny. Vinny doesn't mince words. And Vinny looks over, he's like, "Wow, well, that was a disaster." and you got to appreciate the guy who just says what everybody else is thinking. And there's a part of this with Thomas where you're like, he's just saying what everybody's thinking. He's just being honest. If we're honest with this first century church, that's what they're all thinking. They weren't there. They didn't get to see Jesus with their own eyes. They're thinking the same thing. You know what? If I got to stand where you stand, Peter, yeah, I'd probably buy it. If I stood where you stand, John, I'd probably buy it. But I don't get that luxury. I don't get to do that. So he's just saying what all these people are thinking. He's speaking for them. Unless I see it, unless I touch it, I'm not buying it. And you can't blame him for that. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. You can't blame him for that. But he says those faded words. And suddenly, he's doubting Thomas. Forever. He goes down as doubting Thomas. So then he says these words, and this is what's interesting to me, is a little bit later it says this. From the time he said that to when he sees Jesus, it says this. A week later. I think sometimes we think this happened all at once. Thomas says the words, Jesus shows up, and then he comes to believe it because Jesus puts his hands in front of him. We think it happens like all at one time. There's a week that passes from the time the other disciples saw Jesus to the time that Thomas sees Jesus. And that's got to be brutal, right? Thomas is walking through some serious doubt here. He's got some serious and reasonable doubt that's in his head. And you've got to believe that for an entire week, all the other disciples are chirping in his ear, like, dude, we saw him, I swear. I swear we did. And he's like, I'm just not buying it, guys. And for a week, he walks through this. It's got to be a dark week. It's got to be a week where you question, like, everything you know. Again, we've talked about this, but sometimes tragedy brings on doubt. And I think the myth of faith that we have in our society and in our own heads is, I think one of the myths we have is we believe somehow that faith is a linear progression. It goes up and to the right. We get saved. We have this moment where we pray the prayer. We raise our hand, every head bowed, every eye closed. We go from there, and we start just going up and to the right until the day we die. And that's how faith works. We get a little bit better at it. We have a little bit stronger faith. We started some more disciplines. And somehow that just is supposed to be a linear progression of faith. And it's just not how it works. That's not how faith really works. I'm sure Thomas believed that. Thomas joined Jesus, actually is one of the first followers probably of Jesus. He's fishing. Jesus comes by, follow me, I'm in. He goes with him. And for 3 years, this is what he's doing. And all of a sudden, it's like when the death of Jesus happens, the death of Thomas's relationship with Jesus happens, and he starts to question everything. It's not a linear progression. It doesn't just go, well, I started following Jesus and everything's perfect until the day that I die. And I just keep increasing in faith, increasing in faith. In fact, I would say more often we have these little moments where we're growing in faith, and there's like this horrible thing that happens, a tragedy, an occurrence, an event, where suddenly everything spirals. And instead of going up and to the right, we start to fall backwards. We have this little spiral. In theology terms, it's called embedded theology versus applied theology. Embedded theology is what you grew up with. So if you grew up like I did, you grew up with, like, for instance, things like, we don't dance. Because it's only something the devil and King David did. For instance. We don't dance, we don't listen to certain music, Sandy Patty was okay. I had my Carmen albums, don't get me wrong. And even when that crazy guitar music came out with DC Talk, it was questionable. They talked about tattoos on a guy's belly. Tattoos, people. You know what I mean? Like, that was questionable. It was pushing the line. But there were things like that you were taught as a kid. Films. Going to see movies. Some of you may have grown up with that being a big issue. Of you went to go see a movie and it was like, oh, that's in a dark theater, probably at night. Nothing good comes out of that. But then, like, the Ten Commandments came out or Ben-Hur, and it really threw everybody off. Like, oh no, what if there's good things in the movie theater too? Can't work like that. But that's the way some of us grew up. Some of you, and the reality is we deal with these things all the time. We deal with these constantly. But we think that there's this constant progression. And think about it in Thomas's stance, because this is a much bigger issue for him. We think that there's this embedded theology, the things we've always known, the things we've always understood, the things that we've lived with from the day we were born. But then suddenly something spirals you out of control. Something knocks you for a loop. And suddenly you're like, wait, what do I believe after all about this? I don't know what I believe. I know I had a moment like this with my sister not that long ago. I was brought up in a house, and listen, I'm not condoning this. Don't think I'm on board with this. But I grew up in a house where, we were married. You were married till the day you died, and I still believe that. I believe that marriage is one of the most sacred things that happens. And we were brought up that way. But I got a call from my sister one day, and she tells me about her husband who's been conducting multiple affairs, who's been doing some terrible things behind her back, and they've been through a year of counseling, and he's just decided that's the way I'm going to live my life. And it was the first time in my life where I had to wrestle with, what do I really think about divorce? Where do I really stand with this? The black and white got a lot more gray, right? That's the difference between the embedded theology and this applied theology, where suddenly in our lives we start to go, this just got a lot more difficult. Where do I really stand with this issue? Where do I really stand with this personally? And we have an issue with that, I think, sometimes. Thomas is in a spot right now where he's moving from this embedded theology of what he's always known, what he's always understood, what's always happened, to suddenly Jesus dies, and everybody else is saying he's alive, but he's really starting to doubt. And he's in this spiral. It's not a linear progression. It's got to be an agonizing week for Thomas. But it says a week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them again. He just keeps doing this move. And he comes and stands among them, and he says, "Peace be with you." Then he says to Thomas, "Just put your fingers here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Now, the first thing I love is that Jesus doesn't come in and condemn him. Notice that? Jesus doesn't come in and he's like, "Hey guys, we've all met up before, but Thomas, listen man, you got to step it up. It's embarrassing." He doesn't say like, "I'm glad you guys believe, but Thomas doesn't get it." He understands his doubt. And I think that Jesus, honestly, I think he respects honest doubt more than he respects blind belief. I think he'd rather have people be honest about their doubt with him than blindly just believe something because they're supposed to, because it's been embedded in them since day one. I think he'd rather have honest doubt than blind belief. So he doesn't condemn him. And then notice what he says. He says, "Now stop doubting and believe." Notice what he doesn't say, though. He doesn't say, "Now stop doubting and know." He could say that because he's showing him the proof, right? Stop doubting and know. You know now, right? No. He doesn't say stop doubting and know. He says stop doubting and believe. See, I think one of the other myths we have about our faith is that too often we think that if we get all of our facts together and all of our formulas together, that somehow that's going to equal faith. Facts about how we know about God, the facts we know, the things we can fill our heads with about God, which is great stuff. It's important stuff, but that is not going to equal a relationship with God. It's not going to equal suddenly that we believe in God. It does not equal that. I know a lot of great atheists who can tell you a lot about the Bible. Doesn't mean they believe it. We can know formulas. We can think, well, God works like this. This is the way he has to work. We box him in. We tell him how he's supposed to do things, right? And we do that all the time. And we think if we have these facts and we have these formulas, suddenly we're going to have faith. That's not the way it works. Facts and formulas do not equal faith. And the truth is, we think he's like some kind of equation that we're going to understand God. If we just had all the facts in front of us, all the proof in front of us, we'd believe in him. But I am so glad, I don't know if you are, but there are times where I am so glad that this is one of the few mysteries that I don't think we're ever going to figure out. And I'm okay with that. Because I think that a God that we can rationalize is not a God who's worth having a relationship with. I think a God that we can like totally understand is probably not a great God at all, actually. If he's that simple, he's probably not sovereign. What I'm trying to say is if I can get him, he's probably not worth being gotten. Because I know the finite limits of my mind. I know I'm not that bright. I know that. And I know if I could fully understand our God, he's probably not that great after all. And that's why it's faith. I think there's always going to be a piece of it where we just have to trust. We're never going to get all the facts. We're never going to get all the formulas. That's the way it's going to work. And I'm glad about that. I don't know if you are. I think that's a good thing. So I think we have this idea that if we get those things lined up, it's all going to work out. But he still tells Thomas to believe. At the end of the day, you still have to believe. He says to him, then Thomas turns to him, he says, "My Lord and my God." Now notice this, we don't see Thomas actually do any of the things that he asked to do. It doesn't say, then Thomas stood up and Thomas felt his side. Then Thomas put his hands in Jesus' hands. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say he actually followed through with any of it. He just saw it. And maybe it wasn't just that he saw the scars, but it was just that he understood Jesus. Jesus didn't leave him alone in his doubt. And he just understood the kindness and the love of Jesus. And he says to him, he says, "My Lord and my God." Which I love that line. See, John doesn't go from John the doubter to John the believer in spite of his faith. John goes from John the doubter to John the believer because of his doubt. His doubt led him to become John the believer, not John the doubter. Thomas, sorry. Thanks, Annie. That's why we keep you around. Something like that. That's the way this works, though. He doesn't become Thomas suddenly the believer because he in spite of his doubt. It's not like he overcame the doubt and suddenly was John the believer or Thomas the believer. Goodness, what is happening? No, it's a disaster. He doesn't suddenly overcome it. He lives in that. Like, he still may have doubts. Thomas may still walk out of there with other doubts, with other thoughts. Doesn't mean he just overcame it. But Thomas becomes Thomas the believer because of his doubts. It led him to this conversation. It led him to this moment. And then here's the line that John, he just attaches this for an inspiration for these first Christians. For this first century, he's saying, guys, understand this. This is what Jesus wants to say about you. If you're in this spot, if you've had these doubts, if you're sitting there and you're wondering, I would love to have been able to touch his hands. I would have loved to be able to see his side. I would have loved to be able to be in that room, just like these other disciples were. He's saying, if you're in that boat and that's where you're at right now, and that's as far as your faith can go, he says, but Jesus told them, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. That doesn't just apply to those first century Christians who were just a generation removed from Jesus. That applies to us still today. Those of us who wish that we had some kind of linear faith, but sometimes it spirals out of control and we have to get back on track. Some of us that believe that somehow doubts are a bad thing. Some of us that get concerned about the times where tragedy falls in place and we start to get shaky about our faith. Some of us that think that if we get all of our facts together, if we get all of our formulas together, that somehow we'll have faith. All of us that live in that world, he's saying, no, there's something greater for you, and it's just called belief, and you're going to have to give into it. You're going to just have to believe, and your faith will be greater. You will be more blessed because you have not had this experience. You've not just been there with Jesus. You've not been given the proof that everybody else is given, but you've been given something far greater, which is a relationship with Jesus that will go beyond just a room and scars in the sides and in his hands. We've been given that relationship still to this day. And so if you don't have that relationship, if you've just been distant from that relationship, if there's things that you've been doubting, again, the goal of this is not just to pray a prayer and get rid of that. The goal is to begin that relationship with Jesus again, to start to talk with him about that, because again, I think he values honest doubt more than blind belief. And you can be honest with him about your doubt and not just blindly try to go along with your beliefs. You can live in that applied theology, not just your embedded theology that you were given. And you can walk in that with him, with Jesus. So we're going to stand, we're going to pray together, we're going to finish this out. We're going to sing this song saying that we're no longer slaves to fear, to doubt, to discouragement. We're no longer slaves of that because Jesus has risen, because he has come for us, because he has shown himself to us, and because we walk in relationship with him. We're no longer that. We're now children of God. Let's stand together. We'll pray. God, I thank you so much for this passage. I thank you for John the doubter, Thomas the doubter. I thank you for this story and for a guy who would be honest about his doubts, not just for himself, but God, that Thomas would be honest about his doubts for all of us. That we can all learn from his doubts, but we can all learn from his newfound faith again, God. I thank you that it doesn't just apply to him, that it wasn't just for Thomas that you walked into that room. It was for every single one of us. And so God, I thank you for sending your son. I thank you for this mystery of Jesus. And God, as we try to rationalize it, as we try to find more facts, more figures about him, as we try to understand him more and try to put him into formulas, God, I pray that you would continue to draw us away from that and just put us into faith. Not that we'd be lazy, not that we'd be incompetent about you, but God, that we would just be able to understand that there's a relationship we have with you that doesn't just go into our heads, but it goes into our hearts. That we would understand you not just through facts, but God, through feelings, through our relationship with you. So God, I pray that if we're trying to rationalize you, that we would give that up and just give you a relationship with us. That's what you've wanted since day one. That's why you sent your son to this earth, was not to prove things to us, but to love us and have us love you in return. So God, I pray that you would just speak to us during this time as we sing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for your goodness that goes beyond our understanding. Praise in your name.